I genuinely don't think this custom would have been possible without the help of Desktop Vandal over on Instagram. He had quite a lot of helpful information on how to do this sort of thing, so check him out, the link is in the description. Hello and welcome to the next Alien in the Ben 10 lineup. Obviously we're going to be doing Ghostfreak, and this is the Super 7 Shadow Demon, I believe from the Dungeons & Dragons series. And you can see here where the inspiration for using this figure comes from. It's got a pretty good setup, just general body shape wise. It is a little on the small side. I'll get into what parts we're going to be using and discarding in a minute. But you can see what I'm going for there when you cover up the wings and the head. You know, he's Ghostfreak-ish. He also comes on this really nice stand, which makes it very easy to pose for this kind of design. But bringing in the paints, I used the High Coat White Primer and the High Coat Matte Lacquer. Again, High Coat, please sponsor me. As well as some airbrush paints. Literally just fillet home model air will do just fine for this. I didn't airbrush anything, I just find them easier to paint with for what I was doing. Now, taking a look at this guy again, obviously we're not going to want these wings, so these do just pop out, they're on a little ball socket, so we can get rid of those. And he's already looking a bit more like Ghostfreak, but obviously this head isn't correct at all, so we'll get rid of this as well, which was quite hard to remove. And you can see, if we were to just replace the head here, we would end up with a fairly muscular Ghostfreak. The tail is the main bit that works well for this, so yeah, it's Ghostfreak, but we're not going to use that either. This is the main piece I'm going to be using for this custom. So without further ado, let's bring in the 3D modelling. Now, starting off with Tinkercad, which is where I tend to start everything for 3D modelling, which I really should upgrade to a better 3D modelling software, but this works just fine. This long pole is what I used for scale reference, so I know how tall to make my model in Blender. You can see it's 150 centimeters, so just kind of standard 6-inch scale figure. And then we'll get back to what that spike is in a minute. All of this here is just my kind of like ball socket sizing, and obviously the actual ball socket itself, as well as the ball peg. So that cylinder on the left is, again, just for spacing, creating the hole for the socket to fit into. This socket, it's currently green, I'm going to make it black so it's a bit easy to follow along. This will be TPU, and then the actual ball peg itself will be resin 3D print. And this was heavily inspired by Desktop Vandal over on Instagram. Again, it'll be linked in the comments and the description below. Huge help on how to make a 3D printed figure. I hadn't even thought of this. And then here's the elbow joint that I'm going to be using. So again, I've just made a TPU bushing that will fit in this socket here. And then this is just what I'm going to use for, again, scale referencing and removing parts so that I've got the space to put that joint in. Now moving over to Blender, I sculpted this from a quad sphere, so this is literally just a basic quad sphere that I've done what I'm sculpting with. And you can see along the side all of my different items that I've put into a collection, so it's easy to follow along with. So I basically just pulled parts out using the mirror tool, remeshed, resmoothed, and then just kind of messed about with it until I got to this look. Once I got to here, went and added the detail, and you can see it's looking a lot more like Ghostfreak like this. In order to do his tail, I turned off the mirroring, and the same for all of his line work. Now, if I'd thought properly about this, I would have kept his arms straight, because it would have been so much easier to turn those into jointed parts. I basically spent more effort making it look just like my reference image, which was just the art reference from the Ben 10 series, which means his arms are going to be really difficult to repose later. And here you can see that scale reference just cylinder that I brought in from Tinkercad. And I did make him slightly smaller than this, obviously because he's going to be floating. I didn't want him to be 6 inches plus the floating base, because he's basically the same height as Heat Blast according to scale reference. And then here's the Omnitrix, which is just obviously sunk into that little hole in his chest. This is the same Omnitrix model I've used for everything else, so I just Boolean unioned it into his chest and just made that one object. So there's the quad sphere that I used to make all of this, and then I just kind of duplicated it and turned it into this weird goop thing to cover his arm. And then I can Boolean difference that to remove the arm and create a socket in the body. Obviously mirror that onto the other side and create the socket on each side. And I can Boolean intersect it, and that will remove the arm from the body and leave only that arm. So obviously in this collection I've got all of my hinges and ball pegs and whatnot, but that doesn't make a whole lot of sense yet for this file. But onto this section of the file, you can see what I mean by the intersect. It does create that curve that I've got going into the torso. And obviously this is now the entirely split up 3D model, I suppose. You can see how difficult this arm would have been to do, because I've now straightened it out and obviously rounded everything and separated it into parts, and would have been so much easier if I had just done this in a straight line to begin with. So now onto my duplicated file, where I went about making sure all the joints would work and basically just making the figure itself more like a figure and less like a separated model. And yes, all those joints that are kind of dotted around the figure, they're dotted in that area so I know where they're going to go once I've printed them. You can see also I've done 2 pairs of hands. And then there's a little peg hole in the back, so this will fit kind of like the standard peg you buy off Amazon for a display stance, like SHF-like. And also the arms are different, so I've had to duplicate them and then split them. And then here's where this big spike comes in. So I've got ghost tentacles because he was just missing something. And I feel like this is quite an important accessory for Ghostfreak. And this is where my sculpting goes a bit weird, because there's no reference image for the front of what this thing looks like. So it's not, it works well for what it is. I'm not the biggest fan of how it looks without the tentacles. Obviously I sculpted this all with tentacles in there for reference, and then again Boolean difference everything out, but I feel like this is something that needs to be blurred. It just seems a bit graphic, which it has the same issue as Ripjaw's mouth. But obviously printing these, everything that was resin printed, I printed an ABS-like resin on my Elegoo Mars 4 Ultra for the black, and anything that was grey I've printed on my Mars 5 Ultra. And yeah, these just, they look really dodgy. They work well when they're glued together. The irony of closed cavity, it's very much open. Yeah, they look a bit weird. You have to trust the process. They end up working well, and they don't look that bad once they're done. So then in Elegoo Slicer, I've done my TPU, and you can see all these settings here. I'm using a 0.2mm nozzle with Every1 Hyper TPU. I had so many issues getting this TPU to work, so please feel free to use these settings if they're of any use. You'll see the print quality later. It's not amazing, but it works well. So I'm using the Elegoo Centauri Carbon, as you can see at the top. And like I said, with that 0.2mm nozzle that I bought to specifically do this custom, because the 0.4mm nozzle does not work for the wrist joints and it makes all the other bits too thin. Those wrist joints are the ones that are the tiny little ball sockets at the bottom right of that set. Then here's the other settings I've got for the TPU itself. I did have a bit of a nightmare, which you'll see later. I didn't realise that when I replaced the nozzle wasn't going to be the exact same size as the 0.4mm nozzle, as in like the machined fitting into the machine. Like I kind of thought because they're 2 machined parts that they'd be interchangeable without having to change much with my actual 3D printer. You'll see why it's so important to kind of rehome everything, even though I thought it rehomed itself anyway. because it had a bit of an issue. So bringing in the build plate here, you can see for how small these are, they're literally like a couple of millimeters. They work really well. They are absolutely tiny, but the build quality on them is fairly good. They do begin to split unless I glue them into the actual ball joint areas. It's just kind of if I put it in and then put the ball peg in and then pull the ball peg out, occasionally it will rip the top layer off, which obviously is the lip that holds the socket over the ball. But removing the TPU from the print bed, you can see the issue here. This isn't the bottom layer that's left. This is engraved into my print bed. So the 0.2mm nozzle that I bought was apparently like 0.2mm longer than my 0.4 nozzle, and so when I tried to print, it just kind of gouged through my print bed. I've since fixed it, but yeah, didn't realise that'd be an issue. That's my fault, really. Then obviously here's the tentacles that I've printed. You can see the harsh cut off at the top and the bottom. That's because it did not fit on my printer, so the actual support material just didn't print in the areas that don't fit. And then here's... It really doesn't look right. Again, you're going to have to trust the process. So this is my prototype for Ghostfreak. He's got all the TPU parts in. And obviously I've put all the ball pegs in here as well. And this was my first model. I did switch the TPU bits out for the ones that printed better. Because originally when I did it, his joints were really, really loose because I got the tolerances wrong. And you can see they're still not right in this prototype. But he works, he's got a decent range of movement. And then bringing his arm in, I got the tolerances really wrong on the bicep, so that bicep does not twist anymore, it's just kind of jammed. But I made the shoulder too loose, which you can see there. And then the elbow, I didn't make the hole big enough for the actual elbow joint, so it didn't fit all the way into the sockets, and it got jammed, as you can see by the fact that it's just kind of hanging out the arm, but I can't pull it apart. But the proof of concept works, like it has a decent amount of range to it. It just doesn't look very good. And then you can see the new shoulder joint. And you can see this cut-in that I've done. And that cut-in is purely so that he can raise his arm to like a 90-degree just out from his body, like that there. It just gives the clearance between the actual joint and the shoulder piece. And there's that bicep swivel working a lot better because I actually fixed the tolerances in it. Now this is the wrist joint. It's ridiculously small, and also it's the reason I've had to buy a new nozzle for my printer. But it works surprisingly well. And then that also just fits inside the little recess that's in the wrist for the arm. And there's a tiny little ball on the hand itself. Now I surprisingly haven't had any of this break yet. I did test them until breaking and it seems to work quite well. Once I'd done that white one, I went and printed it all black and obviously made just his kind of intangible form. And this was quite fun. I'm really glad that I did this one, so I'm going to have the black ones and the grey ones available for sale. I'm going to be selling, I think I'll be selling 10 of these, but I'll do 5 for now. If you want to buy one of these, they will be available through Instagram. If you DM me on Instagram, I'll be selling them through that, because Etsy's fees are ridiculous, so I'd rather just do it through PayPal Goods and Services. When I bring in that stand, again, this is the only bit I've actually used from said figure. So here he is, it works really nicely. I just have to use the heat gun to make sure that the tail would fit in properly. And I bring this piece back in, it does look a bit better now that it's grey on the inside. It's got the back line work, it doesn't look quite as dodgy. Still dodgy, but not as bad. Again, didn't realise this is what it looked like until I started to print it. And then here's the tentacles. I've just kind of taped over the areas I wanted to stay black and then used that white primer and then given that a matte lacquer to protect it as well. Now, to my female audience, I can only apologise. This part of the video doesn't look nice at all. So to the 11.7% of you watching, again, I'm sorry about this. This is just me trying to remove some of the paint so I can glue directly to the print, so it's got a bit of a better bond. And here you can see it glued in. It no longer looks as dodgy. It looks a lot more safe for work. And yeah, I think this works quite well. Now that we're past the awful looking stage, it looks very Ghostfreak. So bringing in the actual grey version, this is just printed in that grey, obviously matte lacquered to give it a nicer finish, and sanded for the most part. And this guy came out really nice. I've used black airbrush paint to get into all of his recesses and sanded away the excess that kind of overspills. The joints are nice and tight, he's got some good tolerance. And it does start to loosen up a tiny bit, but I've not had any actual loose joints yet. They were really tight when I did them originally, and they've softened up enough that they work well now. Yeah, I'm very impressed with how this works. Amazing idea from Desktop Vandals to use TPU. If you want more information on how he does that, go and check out the Instagram. Again, linked in the description and the comment section below. Just phenomenal. And here you can see the range that this figure's got. Fairly decent for a 3D printed figure that's meant to keep the form of a cartoon character. And like I said, if you are interested in this, I will be selling them over on Instagram, so if you hit me with a DM, we can get through to actually adding you to a pre-order set. I'll be doing 5 to begin with, and then I'll maybe do another 5 later on. We'll see how it goes. And obviously this guy's 3D printed, so there is that bit of having to be careful with joints, obviously not over forcing them, because if they snap, it is a 3D print at the end of the day. But like I said, I've not had any issues, and you can see that I'm being fairly firm with this thing. The elbow is probably the only real concern. The shoulders and everything I don't think are going to break. The wrist just pops out if you do anything too much with it. It is just the elbow, but again, I've not had any of the elbows break, and I've gone through 3 or 4 versions of this guy. And then bringing him in with his weird chest tentacles. You can see how that fits to him. It just pops right into the wrists. And the elbows are what support that up there. And because it was Boolean difference from his original model, it's fairly flush. And it's obviously not seamless. I could have, in theory, modelled it to the body and had swap out parts for the torso. That would have been overkill and would have risked damaging the joints for the actual TPU ball sockets. So this just made a lot more sense, and I think this works better overall. And with that being our final touch, Ghostfreak is finished, so let's see him in the full 360. So now, with Ghostfreak finished, it's time to add him to the shelf, and that is the original 10 aliens finished. I'll be on to making Kevin 11 and Ben and Vilgax and other characters like that, as well as Cannonbolt and also the other aliens. But this is the OG 10 finished. I say finished. While I am going to go and do the other aliens, I might go back because I'm really happy with how these two have come out, and they are pretty much fully 3D printed. compared to the rest, these are the better looking ones. Grey Matter, Upgrade, and Ghostfreak have the most like 3D print going on with them. I mean, I suppose Stinkfly because he's mostly 3D print as well. But I don't know, it really makes me want to go and redo all of them as 3D printed figures. Upgrade I could easily do. Ghostfreak obviously is fully 3D printed. Stinkfly could work just with a couple upgrades. I don't know, maybe it's something I'll look at going and doing, because I kind of like the aesthetic that Ghostfreak has now. But obviously here's my Ben stand-in, I'll be upgrading him to look like Ben eventually. But thank you guys so much for watching. Let me know what you think. Let me know if you'd like to see them fully 3D printed at some point in the future, and I will get on that.